They built 98 luxury homes on my family's land, made $39.2 million, and thought I'd never find out. Picture this. You wake up one Tuesday morning to the roar of bulldozers tearing through oak trees your great-grandfather planted with his own hands. By noon, they're pouring concrete foundations where your childhood creek used to run. By sunset, there's a luxury subdivision rising from soil that's been in your family since 1943. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with fresh-cut timber hung in the morning air like the funeral of everything 4 generations had protected. But here's what Westfield Meadows HOA President Gladys Thornberry didn't know about Marcus Delacroix. I'm a land surveyor who reads property lines like sheet music, and more importantly, I know exactly how to read people who think rural folks are too stupid to fight back. What would you do if you discovered an entire neighborhood was built on land that's been in your family for 80 years? Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from, and have you ever dealt with a corrupt HOA that thought they could steal from you? I read every single comment. This is that story. My name is Marcus Delacroix, and I'm a third-generation land surveyor in Millbrook County, Tennessee. If you've never been to this part of the world, imagine rolling green hills that stretch to the horizon, where morning mist rises from valleys like smoke from a grandmother's pipe. The air here carries the sweet scent of honeysuckle climbing fence posts that my grandfather hammered into the ground with his own 2 hands. 847 acres. That's what Ezra Delacroix bought in 1943 with his GI Bill money after coming home from Normandy. He chose this land because it had good water, fertile soil, and enough timber to build whatever dreams a man might carry. 3 generations later, it was mine along with the responsibility of caring for my mother Ruth, who at 78 was showing the early signs of dementia that would steal her memories one cruel day at a time. I'd been recently divorced, one of those casualties of middle age where 2 people realize they've grown into strangers. So it was just me and Mom in the old farmhouse, trying to figure out how to navigate this new chapter of our lives. That's when Gladys Thornberry showed up. Picture a woman who treats every conversation like a hostile takeover. Perfectly coiffed silver hair that probably costs more than most people's car payments. Always dressed in power suits that scream, "I own things you can't afford." She drove a white Cadillac Escalade that gleamed like fresh snow even after driving down our gravel road, a vehicle that had probably never seen a day of honest work in its pampered life. Gladys had moved down from Atlanta 5 years earlier, one of those transplants who immediately began improving our little rural community whether we wanted improvement or not. She'd made herself HOA president of every development within a 20-mile radius, collecting titles like "Some People Collect Stamps." On that particular Tuesday morning in April, she came marching up to my property with a clipboard and a measuring tape, her heels making that angry crunch-crunch sound on our gravel driveway that immediately put my teeth on edge. "Mr. Delacroix," she announced without so much as a good morning, "I'm here about the disputed boundary on your 40-acre section." Disputed boundary? I'd been surveying land for 25 years. I knew every inch of our property like the back of my weathered hands. "Ma'am, there's no dispute," I said, pulling out my grandfather's original deed from the kitchen drawer where we'd kept it safe for decades. "Property lines were hand-surveyed when Grandpa bought this place. Every boundary marker is exactly where it should be." She waved her photocopied papers at me like they were some kind of legal weapon. "I have documentation showing a mapping error from 1987 that affects the southeastern section. This will need to be settled properly through the courts." Now, I've dealt with plenty of difficult property owners over the years. Hell, surveying disputes come with the territory. But something about Gladys's tone, that particular blend of condescension and barely concealed irritation, told me this wasn't about boundaries at all. "I suggest you hire a lawyer, Mr. Delacroix," she said, her voice dripping with fake concern. "These matters can become quite expensive for people in your situation." The way she said "your situation," like being a rural landowner was some kind of character flaw, made my blood pressure spike. She climbed back into her Escalade and roared off, leaving behind the acrid smell of exhaust and something that felt an awful lot like a threat. That night, I sat on the front porch with Mom, watching fireflies dance over the pasture while she told me the same story about Grandpa's war medals for the 100th time. But even in her confusion, Ruth grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Something's not right about that woman, Marcus," she said, her eyes suddenly clear as mountain spring water. "Your grandfather used to say that some people collect other folks' misery like it's a hobby." Turns out Mom was right, but I wouldn't understand just how right for another 3 weeks. 3 weeks later, The lawsuit arrived by certified mail on a Thursday morning that started with promise and ended with my coffee growing cold while I read the most ridiculous legal document I'd ever seen. Gladys Thornberry wasn't just claiming a boundary dispute, she was filing for adverse possession of my family's land. For those who've never had the pleasure of being legally mugged, adverse possession is when someone claims they own your property because you supposedly abandoned it. According to her fancy Atlanta lawyers, I'd abandoned 40 acres by not developing it into a shopping mall or subdivision. The smell of fresh legal paper mixed with my mother's bacon cooking in the kitchen created one of those surreal moments where normal life collides with absolute insanity. Ruth shuffled over in her house slippers, squinting at the papers with the kind of clarity that sometimes cut through her confusion like sunlight through storm clouds. "What's that woman want now?" she asked. "She wants our land, Mom. Says we abandoned it because we didn't pave it over." Ruth snorted, a sound that somehow conveyed 4 generations of farming wisdom. "Abandoned? Boy, your grandfather would roll over in his grave. That man walked every inch of this property twice a week until the day he died." The lawsuit gave me 30 days to respond or forfeit by default. 30 days during my busiest surveying season to hire a lawyer I couldn't afford to fight a case that shouldn't exist. It was legal warfare designed to drain my resources and break my spirit like a boot crushing wildflowers. But here's the thing about being a surveyor: you learn to dig deeper when the surface doesn't make sense. My old mentor, Jake Hutchinson, used to drill into my head that you always verify property boundaries with the original deed language, not modern maps that might contain errors. Those old meets and bounds descriptions, he'd say, chewing on his ever-present toothpick, use permanent landmarks that don't lie, creek beds, rock outcroppings, iron stakes that'll outlast politicians and their promises. I spent that weekend in the courthouse basement, surrounded by filing cabinets that smelled like dust and decades of bureaucratic secrets. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps while I traced through property records going back to when Tennessee was still arguing with North Carolina about where one state ended and the other began. Found Grandpa's original 1943 deed, written in that precise legal language they used back when words actually meant something. It described our property boundaries using iron stakes driven deep into the ground at specific compass bearings. A surveyor's breadcrumb trail that would either save my family's legacy or prove me a fool. Saturday morning found me hiking the southeastern section with my metal detector, following Grandpa's survey notes like a treasure map. The spring air carried the scent of wild dogwood and fresh earth as I swept the detector back and forth across 40 acres of memories, listening for the electronic song that would either vindicate my grandfather's work or leave me scrambling for answers. Beep. First stake, exactly where the deed said it would be, buried under 4 decades of leaf litter but solid as a promise kept. My hands shook as I brushed away the dirt, revealing the iron post that Grandpa had driven home with his own sledgehammer. Beep. Second stake, right on the money. Beep. Third stake, perfectly aligned with the others like stars in a constellation only a surveyor could read. Every boundary marker exactly where it should be, proving our property lines hadn't moved an inch since 1943. I photographed each stake with GPS coordinates, creating evidence that would make any honest court laugh Gladys's lawsuit out of the room faster than a cat with its tail on fire. But here's where things got interesting. And by interesting, I mean infuriating in that special way reserved for people who think rural folks are too stupid to fight back. When I filed my countersuit with photos of the original survey markers, Gladys's response came back within 24 hours. Not the usual legal foot-dragging you'd expect, but immediate panic disguised as legal maneuvering. She offered to settle out of court for $15,000. Now, I may be a simple country surveyor, but I wasn't born yesterday. Nobody offers 15 grand to fix an honest mistake. You offer money when you're caught red-handed and hoping the victim is too broke or too stupid to keep fighting. It's like a burglar offering to pay for the window he broke generous until you realize he's already stolen your television. That's when I started digging into Gladys's other legal activities, and what I found made my stomach drop like a stone into deep water. She'd filed identical boundary disputes against 3 other families in the past 2 years. Same legal language, same Atlanta law firm, same pattern of targeting elderly or financially struggling landowners like a hawk circling injured rabbits. Two of those other families had settled rather than fight expensive legal battles. They'd signed away portions of land that had been in their families for generations, accepting small cash payments to make the legal harassment stop. But what was Gladys really after? 40 acres here, 30 acres there? What kind of master plan required stealing land from old farming families? I spread my survey maps across the kitchen table that night, connecting the dots between all the properties Gladys had targeted, and the pattern that emerged made my blood run cold. By Monday morning, Gladys had escalated from legal intimidation to bureaucratic warfare, and I was learning exactly how creative people can get when they smell blood in the water. The first salvo arrived disguised as a friendly visit from county code enforcement. Billy Reynolds, who I'd known since high school, stood on my porch looking more uncomfortable than a preacher in a honky-tonk, holding a clipboard thick enough to choke a horse. "Marcus, I'm real sorry about this," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man forced to betray his own conscience. "Got complaints about unpermitted structures on your property." He was talking about Grandpa's barn, the one built in 1962, when permits were something city folks worried about, and country people just built what they needed. The smell of old hay and motor oil drifted from the barn's open doors, carrying 40 years of honest work and family memories. "Billy, that barn's been there longer than either of us have been breathing," I said. "I know it, and you know it," he replied, avoiding my eyes. "But I got orders from higher up. County says you need permits for agricultural structures, septic systems, even that old chicken coop your grandmother built." The chicken coop hadn't housed chickens since the Clinton administration, but suddenly it was a code violation, requiring immediate attention and substantial fees. Amazing how a structure that had been invisible to county officials for decades became a pressing public safety concern the moment I challenged Gladys Thornberry's land grab. That same week, 3 of my regular surveying clients mysteriously canceled their contracts. Tom Brennan, who'd used my services for 8 years, called to say he'd decided to go with someone else, in a voice that sounded like he was reading from a script. Sarah Martinez at the engineering firm suddenly found my work not quite what we're looking for anymore. Coincidence? About as likely as finding a unicorn grazing in my back pasture. But while Gladys was playing bureaucratic chess, I was learning to think like a detective. My old friend Paulette Hawkins, who'd spent 30 years as county records clerk before retiring, knew where every skeleton was buried in the courthouse basement. Over coffee at Mabel's Diner, surrounded by the comforting clatter of breakfast plates and small-town gossip, Paulette helped me piece together the real picture. "Honey, you need to look at this like connecting dots in a children's coloring book," she said, her silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the diner's windows. "One property dispute might be random, 3 or 4. That's a pattern with a purpose." We spent the next 2 weeks systematically reviewing every property transfer involving Thornberry's firm. Paulette taught me to cross-reference deed transfers with development permits and HOA incorporation filings, bureaucratic breadcrumbs that most people never think to follow. The coffee at the courthouse snack machine tasted like burnt motor oil, but the discoveries we made were worth every bitter sip. What we found would have made a career criminal jealous of Gladys's organizational skills. Over the past 5 years, Thornberry's firm had acquired 847 acres through boundary disputes, tax settlements, and estate complications. Each acquisition followed the same playbook: target elderly or financially struggling landowners, initiate expensive legal challenges, then swoop in with settlement offers that seemed generous until you realized the land's true value. The pattern was methodical as a surgeon's incision and twice as ruthless. Families who'd owned land for generations were systematically pressured into selling portions at below-market prices rather than face bankruptcy, fighting legal battles they couldn't afford. But here's where my surveying background gave me an advantage that Gladys hadn't counted on. I knew how to read those old property descriptions like sheet music. Using GIS mapping software from my office, I overlaid all the acquired properties onto current development maps, and the picture that emerged made my hands shake as I reached for my 3rd cup of courthouse coffee. Every single piece of disputed land fit together like puzzle pieces, forming one massive development project. Gladys wasn't randomly grabbing property. She was methodically assembling the pieces for Westfield Meadows, a luxury subdivision that would house 98 homes at $400,000 each. The math was staggering. $39.2 million in gross sales, built on land acquired for pennies on the dollar through legal intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. My family's 40 acres wasn't just another target. It was the final piece needed for the development's main entrance road. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by maps, deeds, and the growing realization that I wasn't just fighting for my family's land. I was the last obstacle standing between Gladys Thornberry and the biggest payday of her career. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Outside, spring peepers sang their ancient songs in the creek where Grandpa had taught me to fish, and for the first time since this whole mess started, I felt something that hadn't visited me in weeks. The cold, calculating satisfaction of a man who finally understands his enemy's weakness. The escalation came at dawn on a Tuesday that started with frost on the grass and ended with me questioning everything I thought I knew about small-town civility. Gladys arrived at 6 in the morning with Sheriff's Deputy Mike Collins in tow, her white Escalade crunching over the gravel like an invading army. The smell of wood smoke from my neighbor's chimney mixed with the harsh bite of early morning air as I stepped onto the porch in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, wondering what fresh hell was about to unfold. "Mr. Delacroix," Gladys announced with the authority of someone who'd clearly practiced this speech, "we're here to conduct an immediate survey of the disputed boundary. Deputy Collins is present to ensure there's no interference with the legal process." Mike looked about as comfortable as a cat in a bathtub. We'd gone to high school together, played on the same baseball team, and he knew this whole situation stunk worse than week-old fish bait. "Marcus, I'm sorry about this," he said quietly, "but I got orders to keep the peace while they do their measuring." Their survey involved a man with a fancy instrument who spent 20 minutes pretending to take readings while Gladys photographed everything with the enthusiasm of a tourist at Graceland. She was building a case that I was destroying evidence by continuing normal farm operations on my own land. The absurdity might have been funny if it wasn't so threatening. By afternoon, the harassment had gone public. The Millbrook County Herald ran a story titled "Local Landowner Blocks Community Development," painting me as a stubborn old coot standing in the way of progress and economic growth. Reading it was like watching someone describe a completely different person who happened to share my name. According to sources close to the development project, the article read, "Mr. Delacroix has refused reasonable offers to resolve boundary disputes that could benefit the entire community." Sources close to the development project. Right. I could practically smell Gladys's expensive perfume wafting off the newspaper. But while she was playing public relations games, I was learning the fine art of electronic surveillance. Tennessee's one-party consent law meant I could legally record any conversation I was part of, knowledge I'd picked up from Jake Morrison, an investigative reporter who'd been sniffing around rural development corruption for the better part of a year. Jake had the lean, hungry look of a bloodhound who'd caught an interesting scent. Over lunch at the diner, he taught me how modern smartphones could make anyone a potential investigative journalist, as long as they knew which buttons to push and which laws protected them. "The beautiful thing about corrupt people," Jake said, stabbing his meatloaf with the passion of a man who'd seen too many cover-ups, "is they can't help bragging about how clever they are. Give them the right audience and a sense of security, and they'll confess to crimes you didn't even know they'd committed." That opportunity came sooner than expected. Jake arranged to meet Gladys at the country club, posing as a potential investor interested in luxury developments. What he captured on his hidden recorder was more damning than anything I could have hoped for. "The trick," Gladys's voice came through crystal clear on the playback, "is identifying properties where the owners are vulnerable. Elderly folks, financial difficulties, family disputes, they're much more likely to settle rather than fight expensive legal battles. We've been quite successful at acquiring difficult properties through strategic pressure." Strategic pressure. That's what she called systematically destroying families' financial security and generational legacies. But the smoking gun came when Jake asked about future plans. "Oh, we identified the target properties 3 years ago," Gladys laughed, the sound carrying all the warmth of a January wind. "The boundary disputes and code enforcement issues, those came later. You have to create the motivation for people to sell, you understand." 3 years ago. Before any boundary disputes began. Before any mapping errors were discovered. The entire scheme had been planned from the beginning, with families like mine marked for elimination before we even knew we were under attack. That evening, I sat in Grandpa's old workshop, surrounded by the tools he'd used to build an honest life from Tennessee soil and determination. The recording device sat on his workbench like a small electronic time bomb, containing enough evidence to blow Gladys's entire operation apart. But evidence was only powerful if you knew how to use it, and I was learning that justice and the legal system didn't always travel the same road. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. Delacroix, we should talk. The current situation benefits no one. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer." GT. Generous offer. Strategic pressure. Difficult properties. For the first time since this nightmare started, I found myself smiling the cold, satisfied smile of a man who just realized his enemy had no idea how deep a hole she'd dug for herself. The discovery that changed everything came wrapped in the dusty embrace of family history, hidden in a place where Gladys Thornberry's lawyers would never think to look: my mother's bedroom closet. Ruth was having one of her clearer days, the kind where the fog of dementia lifted like morning mist and left her sharp as the day she'd married my father. We were sorting through old family documents, preparing to move her important papers to the bank's safety deposit box before her condition worsened. "Marcus, honey, help me reach that old leather case up there," she said, pointing to the top shelf where Grandpa's military medals shared space with yellowed photographs and forgotten treasures. The case smelled like old tobacco and decades of careful storage. Inside, beneath his Purple Heart and Bronze Star, lay the original purchase agreement from 1943, not just the deed I'd been working with, but the complete negotiation documents that Grandpa had kept as carefully as he'd maintained his survey equipment. "Your grandfather was nobody's fool," Ruth said, her voice carrying the clarity that sometimes surprised us both. "He knew the government boys who sold him this land were probably keeping secrets, so he made damn sure to get everything in writing." That's when I saw it. A clause buried in the legal language like a seed waiting for the right season to sprout. Grandpa hadn't just bought the surface rights to our 847 acres. He'd specifically negotiated to retain all mineral and subsurface rights, including authority over any excavation deeper than 3 feet. My hands trembled as I read the implications. In 1943, most GI Bill land purchases automatically transferred subsurface rights to the government or kept them with the original landowner. But Ezra Delacroix had insisted on keeping control over what lay beneath his property, probably thinking about potential mineral deposits or water rights. What he couldn't have imagined was that 60 years later, his foresight would give his grandson the power to stop an entire housing development dead in its tracks. Modern luxury subdivisions require extensive excavation foundation work, utility trenching, stormwater management systems, road beds that need to be dug down and built up with proper drainage. Every single home in Westfield Meadows would require digging deeper than 3 feet into soil that Gladys Thornberry had never bothered to check the subsurface rights for. She'd been so focused on stealing surface land through legal intimidation that she'd missed the underground trump card that could shut down her entire $39 million scheme. "Ruth," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "do you remember Grandpa ever talking about why he wanted to keep the subsurface rights?" Her eyes sparkled with the same shrewd intelligence that had attracted my grandfather 70 years earlier. "He said that land wasn't just dirt, Marcus. It was layers of history, and a man ought to own his history all the way down to bedrock. Plus, he figured someday folks might want to dig up what we'd spent so much time protecting." The legal implications crashed over me like cold water. With one court filing, I could halt all excavation on the entire Westfield Meadows development. Construction crews would have to stop work, investors would panic, pre-sale contracts would be voided. But more than that, I now had leverage that could force Gladys to face justice for every family she'd systematically robbed through her strategic pressure campaigns. My phone rang that evening. Gladys's voice was tight with barely controlled desperation when she spoke. "Mr. Delacroix, I believe we should meet immediately to discuss a resolution to our misunderstanding. I'm prepared to offer you $150,000 to settle all outstanding issues." $150,000. Yesterday, she'd been threatening me with code enforcement and media manipulation. Today, she was offering more money than I'd see in 3 years of surveying work. The panic in her voice told me she'd somehow learned about the subsurface rights discovery. The size of her offer told me she understood exactly how much trouble her development was in. But what she didn't know yet was that I'd moved far beyond caring about money. I had bigger plans now. Grandpa's old workshop had been collecting dust and memories for the better part of a decade, but by Thursday morning it hummed with the energy of a military command center planning the most important operation of the war. The smell of machine oil and old wood mixed with fresh coffee and the ozone scent of electronic equipment as I converted the space into something Ezra Delacroix would have recognized, a place where honest people gathered to fight a battle that mattered. Maps covered every wall, connected by red string like a spider web of corruption that finally made sense when you could see the whole picture. My unlikely army assembled around Grandpa's workbench like knights at a round table, each bringing weapons Gladys Thornberry had never seen coming. Paulette Hawkins arrived first, carrying 30 years of bureaucratic secrets in her silver head and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "Honey," she said, surveying our makeshift war room with approval, "your grandfather would be proud. He always said the best defense against bullies was knowing more about their business than they knew about yours." Jake Morrison brought the media strategy, his reporter's instincts honed by years of chasing corruption through the backwoods of Tennessee politics. Dr. Sarah Kim, the environmental lawyer who'd moved here for small-town practice and found herself facing big-city corruption, volunteered her legal expertise with the fierce passion of someone who'd seen too many communities destroyed by predatory development. Tommy, barely 30 but sharp as a surveyor's compass, had driven down from Nashville after learning that Gladys's firm had targeted his grandparents 2 years earlier. His grandmother had lost 40 acres of family land to one of Thornberry's boundary disputes, and he brought digital forensic skills that could trace electronic breadcrumbs through the darkest corners of financial records. Even Sheriff Bobby Landis found ways to help, walking the careful line between official duty and personal justice. "I can't actively investigate until we have probable cause," he said, his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had seen better decades. "But I can make sure y'all understand proper legal procedures for citizen complaints and evidence gathering." Our strategy evolved like one of Grandpa's survey plans, methodical, comprehensive, and designed to leave no room for error. Dr. Kim would file the subsurface rights injunction immediately, creating a legal time bomb that could detonate Gladys's entire development project. But instead of pulling that trigger right away, we'd use it as leverage while building an overwhelming case for systematic fraud. "Think of this like conducting a symphony," she explained, her precise legal mind mapping out our approach. "Each instrument has to come in at exactly the right moment to create maximum impact. File everything simultaneously: criminal referrals, civil suits, media investigation, and community action." Tommy's digital forensics had already uncovered email communications between Thornberry's firm and county officials that read like a corruption manual. "Modern criminals can't help themselves," he said, fingers flying across his laptop keyboard. "They document everything electronically because they think they're too smart to get caught." The evidence was damning. Payment records showing monthly consulting fees to the planning director. Email threads discussing which families would be most vulnerable to pressure. Financial analysis proving the systematic pattern of below-market land acquisitions. Jake coordinated the media strategy with the methodical patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect shot. "We get one chance to tell this story right," he said. "Rush it, and Gladys spins it as harassment by a disgruntled landowner. Time it perfectly, and she becomes the face of rural corruption for every newspaper in the state." Paulette's community networking revealed the true scope of Thornberry's operation. Families in 3 neighboring counties had faced identical boundary disputes and code enforcement campaigns. The pattern was consistent as a factory assembly line target: pressure, acquire, develop, profit. "Here's what most folks don't understand about fighting corruption," Paulette said, her voice carrying the wisdom of someone who'd watched power games from behind a clerk's desk for 3 decades. "You can't just prove they're stealing. You have to prove they're stealing systematically, show the pattern, and make it clear this isn't about one family's land, it's about protecting every family's future." Our communication security involved encrypted messaging apps and document storage in multiple locations. Dr. Kim's legal representation provided attorney-client privilege protection for our most sensitive evidence. We rotated meeting locations to avoid surveillance, though the irony wasn't lost on any of us that we were the ones acting like criminals while fighting actual crime. The timeline became our Bible. Media investigation launches Monday, legal filings Tuesday, community presentation Wednesday, criminal referrals Thursday, each piece carefully orchestrated to create maximum pressure and minimum opportunity for Gladys to respond or recover. As the sun set through the workshop windows, casting long shadows across our battle plans, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this nightmare began: confidence. Not just in our evidence or our strategy, but in the fundamental truth that communities could fight back when they understood their own power. Gladys Thornberry had built her career on the assumption that rural families would stay isolated, overwhelmed, and defeated. She was about to learn that some assumptions can be fatal to your business plan. Gladys Thornberry's desperation manifested itself like a fever-breaking, violent, unpredictable, and ultimately self-destructive. The sabotage started small, almost petty. Survey stakes pulled up overnight, boundary markers moved just enough to create confusion, but not enough to prove deliberate tampering. I discovered the first violation on a Monday morning that smelled like rain and tasted like betrayal, finding my carefully placed markers scattered across the pasture like broken promises. By Wednesday, the attacks had escalated to outright destruction. My surveying equipment and $8,000 GPS unit that represented months of careful saving vanished from my locked truck overnight. The lock hadn't been forced. Someone had used a key or professional tools, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and amateur criminality. Professional thieves would have taken the whole truck, Sheriff Bobby Landis observed, examining the scene with the methodical attention of a man who'd seen enough crime to recognize patterns. This feels personal, targeted, like someone who knows exactly what equipment would hurt your business most. The character assassination campaign launched simultaneously across multiple fronts with the coordination of a military operation. Anonymous flyers appeared on car windshields throughout town, printed on expensive paper that probably cost more than most folks' grocery budgets. Local surveyor Marcus Delacroix has been displaying increasingly erratic behavior, the flyers proclaimed in that careful legal language designed to destroy reputations without risking lawsuits. Sources close to the family report concerns about his exploitation of his elderly mother's confusion regarding property ownership. Reading those words felt like swallowing broken glass. They'd weaponized Ruth's dementia against me, turning her vulnerability into ammunition for their public relations war. The professional sabotage cut deeper than any personal attack. Gladys's firm had filed a complaint with the state licensing board, accusing me of unethical surveying practices and fraudulent boundary determination. The investigation would take months to resolve, but the mere existence of pending charges gave potential clients reason to question my credibility. 3 more surveying contracts evaporated within a week. Tom Brennan called to postpone indefinitely. Now, Sarah Martinez suddenly needed time to reconsider her options. Even my oldest client, the Henderson family, who'd used my services for 15 years, apologetically canceled their upcoming property survey. But while Gladys was destroying my reputation and income, my team was building an electronic paper trail that would survive any courtroom scrutiny. Tommy's digital forensics had uncovered email communications between Thornberry's firm and the county planning director that read like a manual for systematic corruption. The messages revealed monthly payments disguised as consulting fees and detailed discussions about which families would be most responsive to administrative pressure. Modern criminals are their own worst enemies, Tommy explained, his laptop screen glowing in the workshop's evening light like a window into Gladys's true nature. They think encryption makes them invisible, but they don't understand that metadata and financial records create permanent footprints. Dr. Kim had quietly assembled a network of legal colleagues across the state, connecting our case to similar patterns of rural development fraud. Environmental violations, interstate financial crimes, and federal mail fraud charges were building like storm clouds on Gladys's horizon. The beautiful thing about systematic corruption, Sarah said, her precise legal mind organizing evidence with surgical precision, is that it creates patterns prosecutors love. 1 boundary dispute might be a civil matter. 8 boundary disputes using identical tactics across multiple counties becomes a RICO case. Jake Morrison's investigation had expanded beyond our local situation to reveal a network of predatory development schemes operating across the rural South. Similar operations in Georgia, North Carolina, and Alabama, all using the same legal tactics, the same pressure campaigns, the same financial structures. The scope was staggering. Hundreds of families systematically robbed of generational land through legal intimidation and bureaucratic manipulation. Millions of dollars in profits built on the assumption that rural communities would remain isolated and powerless. But the personal cost of fighting this battle was becoming impossible to ignore. Ruth's condition worsened under the constant stress of legal visitors, media attention, and community conflict. Her moments of clarity became rarer, replaced by confusion and agitation that no amount of medication could ease. The financial pressure threatened everything we'd built. Legal costs, lost income, medical bills, and the constant expenses of maintaining our evidence-gathering operation had pushed me to the edge of bankruptcy. I'd mortgaged my surveying equipment to continue the fight, betting everything on the belief that justice would eventually prevail. The community remained divided. Old friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. Neighbors who'd known my family for generations whispered among themselves about whether I'd lost my mind or found my purpose. That Thursday evening, Gladys made her final desperate offer. $200,000 cash plus covering all my legal costs if I'd sign a comprehensive waiver and disappear quietly from her development plans. The amount revealed her true desperation. She was offering more money than I'd earn in 5 years, trying to buy silence before her entire operation collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. But she'd made one critical mistake. She still thought this was about money, about one man's property dispute, about a simple business transaction that could be resolved with the right financial incentive. She had no idea that she'd awakened something far more dangerous than an angry landowner. She'd created a community organizer. The private meeting took place in Gladys Thornberry's law office on a Friday afternoon that felt heavy with the weight of pending thunderstorms and final ultimatums. Her office screamed expensive success leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, mahogany bookshelves lined with legal volumes that looked more decorative than functional, and windows that offered a commanding view of downtown Millbrook like a general surveying a battlefield she believed she'd already won. Gladys sat behind her desk wearing a charcoal gray suit that could have doubled as armor, her silver hair perfectly arranged despite the humidity that was making the rest of us mere mortals wilt like day-old lettuce. The air conditioning hummed with the quiet efficiency of money well spent, but I could smell her desperation underneath the expensive perfume, sharp and acrid, like fear disguised as confidence. "Marcus," she began, her voice carrying that practiced warmth that reminded me of funeral directors and used car salesmen. "I think we've both allowed this situation to escalate beyond what's reasonable for our community." The recording device in my shirt pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, its presence both terrifying and liberating. Dr. Kim had coached me through the legal requirements. Tennessee's one-party consent law meant I could record any conversation I participated in, creating evidence that could survive any courtroom challenge. "I'm prepared to offer you $500,000, Gladys continued, leaning forward with the intensity of a poker player going all in on a bluff. "Cash settlement, plus guaranteed surveying contracts for the next 5 years. You could provide for your mother's care, secure your retirement, maybe even take that vacation you've been putting off for decades." 500,000. The number hung in the air like smoke from a campfire, impressive until you realized what it was really covering up. "That's generous," I said carefully, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. "But I'm curious, why are you so eager to resolve this particular boundary dispute? Seems like a lot of money for 40 acres of farmland." Her laugh sounded like breaking glass trying to pass for wind chimes. "Marcus, you're a smart man. Surely you understand that development projects create opportunities for everyone. Jobs, tax revenue, progress. Sometimes we have to think beyond our individual interests." "Progress," I repeated, letting the word hang between us like bait on a hook. "Like the progress you brought to the Henderson family, the Washingtons, the Patel family over in Mason County." For just a moment, her mask slipped. The polished attorney vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating that had probably been there all along, hidden beneath layers of professional courtesy and expensive suits. "Those families made intelligent business decisions," she said, her voice dropping to the temperature of January creek water. "They understood that holding on to unprofitable land when someone offers fair compensation is simply impractical. Fair compensation for land you knew was worth 10 times what you paid?" I pressed, feeling the conversation tilt in my favor like a surveyor's level finding true balance. "Marcus, let's not pretend this is about fairness," Gladys said, her true nature finally emerging like a snake shedding its skin. "This is about reality. Rural communities are dying. Young people leave for cities. Old folks can't maintain large properties. We're simply facilitating inevitable transitions." The recording device captured every word as she continued, her voice gaining the confidence of someone who believed she was educating a simpleton about sophisticated business practices. "We identify properties where the owners are vulnerable, elderly, financially struggling, emotionally attached to land they can't properly utilize. Then we create motivation for them to make rational decisions. code enforcement, boundary disputes, administrative pressure. Most people choose to take our settlements rather than fight expensive legal battles they can't win. She was confessing to systematic fraud with the casual pride of someone describing a successful dinner party. "And my family's property?" I asked. "Your 40 acres is the final piece we need for proper road access. Without it, the entire Westfield Meadows development becomes economically unfeasible. So yes, we're prepared to be very generous to avoid that unfortunate outcome." The threat lurked beneath her words like ice under thin snow. Pay up or face destruction. But what Gladys didn't know was that while she'd been orchestrating her final bribery attempt, my team had been assembling the legal equivalent of a nuclear weapon. Sheriff Bobby Landis had quietly contacted the State Bureau of Investigation after reviewing our evidence. Federal agents were examining the interstate financial crimes and environmental violations. Dr. Kim had coordinated with prosecutors in 3 states to file simultaneous charges. Jake Morrison's investigation was ready to publish, timed to coincide with our legal filings and community presentation. "Gladys," I said, standing to leave while her confession burned in my pocket like a coal from hell's own furnace. "I need to think about your offer." "Don't think too long, Marcus," she replied, her voice regaining its practiced warmth while her eyes remained as cold as winter moonlight. "Opportunities like this don't last forever. And neither does my patience." Walking out of that office into the humid embrace of a Tennessee summer evening, I felt like a man who'd just watched his enemy load the bullets into the gun that would destroy her. The town hall meeting was scheduled for Wednesday. Gladys Thornberry had no idea what was coming. The Millbrook High School gymnasium had never seen anything like it. 412 people packed into a space designed for basketball and graduation ceremonies, with the electric tension of a community finally ready to confront its demons. The air hung thick with humidity and anticipation, carrying the mixed sense of nervous perspiration, fresh coffee from the PTA concession stand, and that peculiar smell of old gymnasiums everywhere. Decades of teenage dreams and adult disappointments absorbed into wooden floors and painted concrete walls. 5 news crews had set up their equipment along the far wall, their cameras creating a forest of electronic eyes that would carry this story far beyond our little corner of Tennessee. Jake Morrison positioned himself near the front with his own recording equipment, while state capitol reporters checked their phones and whispered among themselves about the rural corruption story that might finally have legs. Sheriff Bobby Landis stood near the entrance with 2 plainclothes agents from the State Bureau of Investigation, their presence adding official weight to what might otherwise have been dismissed as small-town drama. The county attorney sat in the front row, nervously checking his phone every 30 seconds like a man expecting news he really didn't want to receive. Gladys Thornberry arrived precisely at 7 o'clock, sweeping into the gymnasium like a queen attending a peasant revolt she planned to crush through sheer force of personality. Her navy business suit looked crisp despite the humidity. Her silver hair was arranged with military precision, and she carried her leather portfolio like a shield against the hostile energy radiating from every corner of the room. Her supporters, maybe 30 people who looked like they'd been imported from somewhere with better zip codes, clustered around her like a defensive formation, their polite applause echoing strangely in the vast space when she approached the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," Gladys began, her voice amplified by the gymnasium's ancient sound system until it bounced off the walls like accusation-seeking targets. "I'm here tonight to address the misunderstandings that have unfortunately divided our community over a legitimate development project that will benefit everyone." She painted her vision with the practiced skill of someone who'd sold lies to desperate people for years. 98 luxury homes generating millions in property taxes. Construction jobs for local workers. Economic growth that would lift the entire region out of rural poverty and into suburban prosperity. "Unfortunately," she continued, her voice taking on the tone of a disappointed teacher addressing wayward children, "this progress has been blocked by the confused concerns of elderly residents who don't fully understand modern real estate law." The gymnasium buzzed with angry murmurs. Gladys had just called half the room senile in the politest possible way. I stood when my turn came, dressed in Grandpa's old Navy suit that still smelled faintly of Old Spice and honest work, carrying the weathered leather folder that contained our family's 1943 deed and 80 years of accumulated truth. "Gladys is right about one thing," I began, my voice steadier than my hands as 400 pairs of eyes focused on me like laser beams. This is about understanding real estate law, so let me share what I've learned. The projection screen behind me lit up with the first photograph survey markers that had been deliberately moved, GPS coordinates proving systematic boundary manipulation, timeline evidence showing the pattern of Thornberry's disputes across multiple counties. The gymnasium fell silent except for the hum of air conditioning and the occasional gasp as the scope of the fraud became clear. Elderly couples held hands tighter. Young parents leaned forward in their seats. Teenagers put down their phones and actually paid attention. "But Gladys," I said, turning to face her directly while the evidence of her crimes glowed on the screen behind me, "there's something you need to know about real estate law, something your expensive attorneys apparently forgot to research." I pulled out Grandpa's original deed, its yellowed pages catching the gymnasium lights like a treasure map finally revealed. This deed includes subsurface rights to all 847 acres. Every foundation you want to dig, every utility line you plan to install, every roadbed that needs excavation, all of it requires my permission. Gladys's face went white as fresh snow. Her supporters shifted uncomfortably. The reporters leaned forward like hunting dogs catching a scent. "But here's the really interesting part," I continued, my voice gaining strength as the moment I'd been preparing for finally arrived. "Yesterday, Gladys offered me $500,000 to make this problem disappear. She also had some fascinating things to say about her business model." I nodded to Tommy, who activated the audio system. Gladys's recorded voice filled the gymnasium with the crystal clarity of digital truth. "We identify properties where the owners are vulnerable, elderly, financially struggling, emotionally attached to land they can't properly utilize. Then we create motivation for them to make rational decisions." The gymnasium erupted. 400 voices expressing rage, shock, vindication, and pure small-town fury at being systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted. Gladys stood frozen at the microphone like a deer caught in headlights, her mask of professional competence shattered beyond repair. Sheriff Bobby Landis approached her with the slow, deliberate walk of justice finally arriving at its destination. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about recorded statements regarding bribery and systematic fraud." The cameras captured everything: Gladys's expression of absolute panic, the crowd's roar of approval, the moment when rural justice finally caught up with urban corruption. Justice, it turns out, moves faster when you have federal agents, recorded confessions, and a media spotlight that makes hiding impossible. Within 30 days of that gymnasium confrontation, Gladys Thornberry was indicted on 18 federal charges, including mail fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. The county planning director pleaded guilty to accepting bribes and testified against his former benefactor with the enthusiasm of a man trying to save his own skin. 3 state legislators resigned when their financial connections to Thornberry's operation became public knowledge. The class action lawsuit settled for $4.2 million, compensating every family who'd been systematically robbed through Gladys's strategic pressure campaigns. Watching those checks get distributed at the courthouse felt like Christmas morning for adults who'd almost lost faith in the possibility of justice. All fraudulently acquired lands were returned to their original owners. Property boundaries were restored to their legal positions. The Westfield Meadows development was abandoned, leaving behind only concrete foundations that local kids now used as skateboard ramps, a surprisingly fitting monument to corporate arrogance brought low by community resistance. The personal healing came slower but felt deeper than any legal victory. Ruth's stress-related symptoms improved dramatically once all the noise stopped, as she put it during one of her increasingly rare moments of clarity. We had 6 more months of genuine conversations, shared memories, and quiet evenings on the front porch watching fireflies dance over the pasture. When she passed peacefully in her sleep the following spring, her final words were about how proud Grandpa would have been of the fight we'd won together. My surveying business not only recovered but expanded beyond anything I'd imagined. The Ethics Award from the State Surveyor Association opened doors to clients who valued integrity over convenience. I hired 2 assistants and found myself becoming the go-to surveyor for families who needed someone they could trust with their most precious possession, their land. The unexpected bonus was falling in love with Dr. Sarah Kim, who decided to stay in Millbrook permanently after discovering that rural practice offered challenges more interesting than corporate law ever could. We married in Grandpa's workshop, surrounded by the maps and survey equipment that had helped save our community from predatory development. But the real legacy was what we built from the ashes of Gladys's scheme. The Ezra Delacroix Foundation started with a simple mission: ensure no family would face alone what we'd almost lost together. Using my portion of the settlement money, we established a land conservation trust that helps elderly landowners understand their rights, provides legal assistance against predatory developers, and offers education about recognizing development fraud before it destroys lives. Our free workshops on property law, estate planning, and community organizing have helped protect over 2,000 acres of farmland and forest from inappropriate development. The scholarship program sends rural students to study law, surveying, and community planning, creating the next generation of defenders for places like Millbrook County. Every year on the anniversary of that gymnasium confrontation, we hold Property Rights Day, a community celebration that brings together families from across the region to share barbecue, live music, and stories about standing up to bullies. Children play on land their grandparents almost lost, while teenagers learn about the importance of civic engagement from people who've seen democracy work when communities organize effectively. The ripple effects spread far beyond our county borders. Jake Morrison's investigation won a state journalism award and became a book documenting rural corruption patterns across the South. Law enforcement agencies use our case as a training example for recognizing systematic development fraud. Rural communities from Virginia to Texas have adopted our organizing model to fight their own battles against predatory developers. On quiet mornings when I walk the boundary lines that Grandpa surveyed with his own hands, I can almost hear his voice carried on the Tennessee wind, reminding me that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how impossible the odds might seem. The land remains in our family, protected now by conservation easements that will prevent future development pressure. Wildflowers bloom where bulldozers once threatened to destroy 8 decades of careful stewardship. The creek still runs clear and cold, perfect for teaching the next generation about the difference between the price of something and its true value. Have you ever dealt with a corrupt HOA, predatory developer, or local official who abused their power? Share your story in the comments below. You might be surprised how many neighbors have faced similar challenges. Your experience could help someone else recognize the warning signs before it's too late. If this story inspired you to stand up for your community, smash that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Next week, I'm covering how a retired teacher took down a corrupt school board using nothing but public records requests and a smartphone camera. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. Remember, they count on you staying isolated and overwhelmed. But when communities come together with knowledge, determination, and proper legal support, even the most powerful bullies discover that justice isn't just for those who can afford it. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.